The 6 great demon deities that once sought to destroy the world have finally been defeated by humanity. Even the last of them, the demon deity of the ruined sea, falls in the end. But victory comes at a devastating cost. By the time the final battle concludes, most of the surface has already been swallowed by the sea of death, pushing humanity to the brink of extinction. As the remnants of towering human structures are slowly consumed by the ocean, Lee Se-hun, badly wounded after the final battle, can't shake the feeling that they have still lost. Not only are the surviving heroes nearly wiped out, but even the Tower of Heroes, the very pillar that sustained Earth, has collapsed. And despite the demon deity's death, the disaster it left behind continues to rage on. Lee is not the only one still alive in the last remaining patch of land untouched by the sea. Alongside him are 3 notorious survivors: Mad Hero Yom Sunga, Explosive Hero Louise Vallant, and Ice Hero Amir Singh. The 3 bicker and complain endlessly, even in the face of death. Meanwhile, Lee, humanity's last blacksmith, coldly reminds them that they would have died long ago if not for the weapons he forged. His words provoke them, but none of them dare to challenge his anger. These 3, infamously known as the 3 traitors, were never loyal to humanity or the monsters of Pandemonium. They acted solely for their own benefit, moving however they pleased, earning the title of opportunists. And yet, despite their selfish nature, they survived until the very end, and ultimately contributed the most in the final battle. This realization fills Lee with regret. If they had chosen to fight alongside humanity sooner, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Snapping out of his thoughts, Lee asks if any of them can still survive. The answer is grim. The trio is severely injured, and they won't survive long. Hearing this, Lee closes his eyes and bitterly remarks that things might have been different if they had agreed to help earlier. Moments later, the 3 finally fall. With what little strength he has left, he notices the sea of death closing in on the last piece of land. Realizing his end is near, he decides to forge one final weapon. Reaching into his chest, Lee activates his innate skill, Blacksmith of Bonds. This ability allows him to create special orbs from those he shares bonds with, their properties changing based on the bond and the target's potential. However, when used on himself, it usually produces something inferior, even worse than common iron ore. But this time, what he extracts is different, a colorless or completely empty. Because it contains nothing, Lee decides to fill it with his overwhelming regret. Without hesitation, he begins hammering. As he works, he wonders if the sound he hears is the roaring ruined sea or the familiar waves he has heard ever since awakening his mana. One thing is certain. Whenever that sound echoes in his ears, he creates items beyond imagination. He continues forging until the ore takes the shape of a dull blade, completely ordinary, with no special power. But before he can act, the sea of death surges forward, dragging him into the depths. As his consciousness fades, regret floods his mind. If only he had realized sooner. If only he had helped others earlier. If only he had persuaded those 3 to act sooner. Maybe everything would have been different. And then, at the peak of his regret, a system notification appears. The weapon he forged triggers an imagery manifestation. He acquires a new skill, Return to Origin. Moments later, when he opens his eyes again, he hears someone calling out to him. Confused, he realizes he is still alive. As his senses return, he hears Assistant Han addressing him as a cadet, a title he hasn't heard in 31 years. Looking around, Lee finds himself standing at the entrance exam of Babel Academy. At first, he wonders if this is merely a flashback before death. But then he recalls the imagery manifestation from his final moments. This isn't a memory. He has truly returned to the past. While Assistant Han grows impatient and warns him to focus or be disqualified, Lee ignores the pressure. Instead, he grips his hammer tightly, fully understanding what has happened. He has been given a second chance. This time, he won't repeat the same mistakes. With a renewed sense of purpose and determination, Lee resolves to seize this opportunity and protect everything he once lost. Reborn with a second chance, Lee is determined to do things differently. The first thing on his mind is meeting the 3 traitors again. But before that, he focuses on the task in front of him. Standing at his station, Lee begins hammering the blade with calm precision. The sound immediately catches Instructor Kim's attention. Though the strikes seem slow, they carry a perfect rhythm, each hit producing a clean, resonant tone without even the slightest hint of dissonance. Recognizing the level of control behind those strikes, Instructor Kim quickly realizes that Lee's forging skills are top tier. Without even noticing it himself, he becomes completely absorbed, watching Lee work until the very end. Meanwhile, Lee remains dissatisfied with the weapon's quality. From Instructor Kim's perspective, however, the blade is already exceptional, more than enough to pass the exam instantly. But in a shocking turn of events, Lee suddenly shatters the sword he just created. Both Instructor Kim and Assistant Han are stunned. Calmly, Lee states that he still has a long way to go, and as a blacksmith, he refuses to present something he considers trash. His words only infuriate Assistant Han, who sees this as reckless and disrespectful behavior. Ignoring the outrage, Lee simply requests another chance to redo his assignment, further fueling Assistant Han's anger. Surprisingly, Instructor Kim allows it. He orders Assistant Han to bring additional materials, despite the hesitation. When questioned, Instructor Kim firmly states that this decision does not violate any rules. With no choice, Assistant Han rushes to comply. However, there's a problem. Only 40 minutes remain in the exam. Lee was fully aware of the time limit when he destroyed the first blade. To him, submitting something subpar was never an option. Intrigued, Instructor Kim continues observing him closely and tells Lee to give it his best. With the new materials in hand, Lee moves toward the furnace. Knowing his current body can't handle perfect forging for long, he immediately begins pouring mana into ignition stones. This alarms the other students, who fear the stones might explode if ignited improperly. Ignoring their panic, Lee throws the stones into the furnace. In an instant, flames of 3 to 4 different colors erupt. The students assume something has gone terribly wrong and scramble to find a fire extinguisher. Even Assistant Han urges Instructor Kim to put out the flames. But instead of reacting with concern, Instructor Kim looks disappointed. He tells Assistant Han that such a reaction is expected from cadets, but not from him. Then, he instructs him to observe more carefully. What burns before them are not ordinary flames, but 5-colored fire demon flames, a high-temperature technique created by resonating 5 different types of ignition stones. It requires incredibly precise mana control, yet it's an efficient method that can compensate for low mana capacity. The students are left in awe as they realize the stones didn't explode. Instead, the iron ingot begins to change color under the intense heat. Only Instructor Kim fully understands what Lee is doing. By resonating the ignition stones, Lee has drastically increased the furnace's temperature while altering the ingot's properties, significantly reducing the time needed for forging. Even so, with only 30 minutes left, the situation remains tight. Lee begins hammering once again. The blade quickly takes shape, but as time passes, his mana starts to run out. The protective flow around his body weakens, and the strain becomes evident. At that moment, Lee realizes just how urgently he needs to train this body after the exam. But right now, he cannot afford to slow down. Pushing himself to the absolute limit, he continues forging without wasting a single second. Time slips away rapidly. Soon, Lee moves on to sharpening the blade, and just as the exam comes to an end, he completes his weapon, a 5-colored flame blade. With its completion, Lee acquires a new skill, Artisan of Flames. When the weapon is appraised, the result shocks everyone. It's a high-grade, high-mid quality weapon. The entire room falls silent. Even Assistant Han is left speechless as he formally declares Lee has passed the exam. Later, Instructor Kim calls Lee to his office. He asks whether Lee truly believes that sword was worth submitting. Lee calmly replies that it is, for now. But Instructor Kim can see it clearly. Lee is still not satisfied. Getting straight to the point, Instructor Kim advises him to withdraw his application. Despite Babel Academy's overwhelming reputation, its refining department has failed to produce meaningful results in recent years. Lee already knows this. In the future, the department will be abolished due to its declining standards. Instead, Vulcan Academy will rise as the world's leading institution for blacksmiths. But Lee doesn't hesitate to disagree. In his eyes, Instructor Kim is wrong. The greatest blacksmith academy won't be Vulcan. It will be Babel. Because this time, it's the place he has chosen to enter. Hearing Lee's bold declaration, Instructor Kim calmly responds that if that's truly the case, then Lee must aim to become the top of his class. Without hesitation, Lee confirms his confidence, stating that no one among the students will surpass him. Intrigued, Instructor Kim asks if Lee understands how the top freshman at Babel Academy is selected. Lee already knows. The top 2 students from each department are chosen to take an additional exam, where one representative is selected from each group. From those final candidates, a single student is crowned the overall top of the class. Babel Academy itself is divided into 3 main faculties: the combat faculty Akar Kuf, the support faculty UR, and the technical faculty Borsipa. Within each faculty are dozens of interconnected departments, branching out like roots. To stand at the top of a faculty means achieving the highest evaluation across all those departments, essentially being recognized as top-tier talent by the entire academy. Realizing that Lee has done his research, Instructor Kim shifts his tone. Speaking not as a professor, but as a senior blacksmith, he offers sincere advice. Even if Lee becomes the top of the faculty, finding true success as a blacksmith at Babel will be difficult. For Lee's future, Vulcan Academy would be the better path. Lee understands the sincerity behind those words. Instructor Kim is putting his junior's future above his own position. Even so, Lee refuses to back down. He firmly states that the place he is entering will soon become the best. Though his words border on arrogance, Instructor Kim finds himself not disliking them. In the end, he accepts Lee's resolve, and the two shake hands. At that moment, Lee receives a system notification. He has established a connection with Instructor Kim, currently at level 1. Using his ability, Lee extracts an affinity from him, a fire-infused iron of high rank and mid-low quality. This unique metal contains flame-like properties, resembling wood in structure and capable of storing fire within itself. After completing his admission, Lee returns home. Sitting on his bed, he examines the extracted affinity. While it isn't bad, its size is disappointingly small. His skill, affinity extraction, allows him to quantify relationships and materialize minerals that didn't previously exist, but with such a low connection level, its usefulness is limited. On top of that, Lee's current stats are far worse than those of other freshmen. Though frustrated, he accepts it as the price of returning to the past. There's no point in rushing. Wanting more right now would only be greed. After all, he still has time. This time, he plans to crush the forces of Pandemonium, the same forces that led the 6 demon deities to destroy humanity as part of a larger scheme. To stop them, Lee knows he cannot afford to be selective or hesitant. More importantly, he cannot risk forgetting the future. To prevent that, he decides his next goal is to obtain a skill or tool related to memory retention. With his first step, entering Babel Academy complete, Lee begins planning his next moves. Just then, the system notifies him that his connection has stabilized at level 1 and grants him a new skill, Affinity Imprint. 1 week later, Lee finds himself running late, searching for the training room where the additional exam is being held. After finally locating it, he enters, only to be immediately reprimanded by Dean Michael, who angrily points out that everyone has been waiting for him. Instructor Kim lets out a deep sigh and responds that there are still 10 minutes left before the exam officially begins. However, Dean Michael insists that this is a matter of attitude, not timing. To smooth things over, Instructor Kim apologizes and assures him that Lee will be more careful moving forward. At that moment, Lee realizes something important. It's not just that the refining department is struggling, they're also at odds with the Academy's higher authorities. Now he fully understands why Instructor Kim recommended transferring to another academy. As he takes in the situation, Lee notices a student beside him glaring intensely in his direction. Attempting to greet him, Lee is immediately ignored as the student turns away without a word. Deciding not to waste his time on such behavior, Lee shifts his focus. Just then, another figure arrives late. The dean of the Borsipa faculty, Ryu Yunha. Lee had heard that Ryu once worked at Babel Academy, but he never imagined she would rise to the position of dean. S-rank hero, Weapon Eater Ryu. A powerful figure with the unique ability to grow stronger by devouring weapons, and in Lee's previous life, a longtime customer who frequently traded with him. However, she too met her end during the war. In her final moments, right in front of Lee, she expressed regret over consuming one of his weapons. The memory still lingers. For a brief moment, Lee zones out, until Instructor Kim calls him back to attention and begins explaining the exam. The test will last 90 minutes. During that time, the two participants must craft a weapon that can be used alongside a sword, the same subject from their previous exam. However, this time, there is a strict condition. The weapon must be created using only alchemical smithing. As for materials, they are free to use any ores available in the room. The final products will be judged by Dean Ryu and Vice Dean Barmett, so the students are warned to produce results they can stand behind. With that, the exam begins. Lee prepares himself. Alchemical smithing requires the user to rely purely on mana, carefully resonating with elemental energy to prevent it from going berserk. As he considers his approach, the other student suddenly mocks him, asking if staring at the materials will somehow increase his mana. Lee turns to face him. The student's arrogance is obvious, but before things escalate, Instructor Kim intervenes, instructing him, Hans Barmett, to refrain from making unnecessary comments. Hans immediately apologizes and resumes his work. Hearing the name, Lee quickly realizes who he is. Hans Barmett, the son of Vice Dean Barmett. That explains why both he and Dean Michael seemed familiar. Noticing Lee's realization, Hans grows even more smug. The difference between them is clear. Lee is a commoner, ranked last among the incoming students in both background and mana capacity. Meanwhile, Hans belongs to the prestigious Barmett family, renowned for their alchemical smithing techniques, and possesses mana comparable to top second-year students. In Hans's mind, the outcome of this exam is already decided. Without hesitation, he selects lazulite and Hainam jade, materials known for their high mana density. Dean Ryu observes his choice, noting that both are water-attributed elemental ores. Vice Dean Michael adds that these materials are highly sensitive to fire, making them difficult to smith. However, thanks to the advanced techniques developed by the Barmett family, such challenges are no longer an issue for Hans. When Instructor Kim realizes that Hans can synthesize any or within 30 minutes, he is genuinely shocked. This level of skill surpasses even most second-year students, let alone a freshman. At that moment, Instructor Kim understands the situation. The exam itself has been designed to favor Hans. A tight time limit, abundant materials, and a focus on alchemical smithing, all conditions that play directly to Hans's strengths. Meanwhile, Lee finally makes his move. He selects Hydrate and Wahong Stone, fire-attributed counterparts to the mana-dense ores Hans chose. Seeing this, even Vice Dean Michael remarks on Lee's pride. As Hans continues his work, he glances at Lee's materials and internally mocks him. With Lee's low mana capacity, controlling something as volatile as Wahong Stone should be impossible. This only strengthens Hans's confidence in his inevitable victory. But in the very next moment, Lee activates Affinity Engraving. This skill allows him to equip and utilize affinity stones directly on his body. He attaches Waham iron to his right arm and begins processing the ores. Watching this, Vice Dean Michael frowns. It appears Lee is attempting to resonate elemental minerals using the same attribute, a reckless approach. According to conventional knowledge, elemental materials must be handled with pure mana alone. Forcing resonance in this way should cause the elemental energy to spiral out of control. In Michael's eyes, Lee is about to cause a disaster. But what happens next shocks everyone. Instead of losing control, an intense surge of fire erupts under Lee's command, perfectly stabilized. Within moments, he completes the forging process and presents his creation, a weapon named Wajiako. The room falls silent. It's a rare-ranked weapon, albeit of the lowest quality, but still far beyond what anyone expected. Hans is completely shaken. Under normal circumstances, elemental energy would have gone berserk during synthesis. Yet Lee not only controlled it, he succeeded. Refusing to accept this, Hans recklessly attempts to replicate the feat by forcefully imbuing elemental mana into mana stones. The result is immediate. His attempt backfires, triggering an explosion. Under normal circumstances, once the evaluation is complete, one of the two candidates would be recommended as the top student of the department. However, with Hans injuring himself during the exam, the outcome is effectively decided. He loses by default. But Vice Dean Michael refuses to accept it. To everyone's surprise, he proposes canceling the results and holding a retest, citing Hans's injury as the reason. Instructor Kim immediately objects, arguing that the exam has already been completed and cannot be overturned, especially when the incident was caused by Hans's own carelessness. Michael, however, refuses to back down. Instead, he shifts the blame onto Lee. He argues that the fastest resonance speed officially recorded at the Academy is 5 minutes, yet Lee, who is just enrolled, achieved resonance instantly upon activating his mana. To him, this is suspicious. In reality, what Lee used was alchemy forging. Unlike traditional forging, which kills the ore to reshape it, alchemy forging focuses on understanding the core essence of the material and drawing out its inherent properties. Rather than forcing the material to submit, it harmonizes with it. This method, though not yet widely accepted, will eventually become the standard after years of experimentation. Lee simply arrived at that answer earlier than everyone else. Even so, he has no intention of explaining this to someone who only throws around accusations. So, when questioned, Lee calmly denies knowing anything about it. That response gives Michael the opening he wants. He immediately accuses Lee of cheating, claiming that a freshman from an unremarkable background could never create a rare-grade weapon on his own. Lee is visibly angered by the accusation, but before he can respond, Dean Ryu steps in. She firmly states that the claim is unfounded. Michael, still smiling, suggests disqualifying Lee for cheating and proceeding with a retest. But Ryu has a completely different approach. Instead of arguing, she walks straight up to inspect the weapon. The moment she picks it up, her reaction shocks everyone. Later that afternoon, while walking through the city, Lee reflects on the weapon he created. While it's a solid result, he admits that the fine-tuning is still lacking. Even so, watching Vice Dean Michael tremble with rage was satisfying. As he thinks back on the name, Barmit, something clicks. He recalls a story told by hero Louise in his previous life. Back when she was at Babel, she had purchased a weapon for a cheap price after running errands for a blacksmith. However, that weapon caused severe mana burns, leaving her with lasting trauma. The name of that blacksmith was Barmit. In that moment, Lee realizes the truth. Hans Barmit is directly connected to the incident that led to Louise's suffering. Originally, Lee's plan in this new life was to quickly find the 3 traitors and guide them onto a better path. But now, at least for Louise, things are different. If he keeps Hans in check, her future may change on its own. The next day, a meeting is held within the Borsippa faculty. Several professors oppose the idea of naming Lee as the top student of the department. Ryu calmly asks if they are outright rejecting the decision. Vice Dean Michael responds that they are merely offering advice, pointing out that she has not been in her position for long. While they acknowledge Lee's talent, they insist that his abilities should be evaluated more carefully. Instructor Kim steps in to defend Lee, arguing that their doubts stem from not witnessing his work firsthand. Even if his craftsmanship lacks refinement, his mana control and compatibility with advanced techniques are undeniable. Despite this, the professors remain unconvinced. At that point, Ryu reveals something shocking. The weapon Lee created was only about 60% complete compared to what he originally intended. And that imperfection is precisely what makes his potential so extraordinary. Still, the room remains divided. Seeing this, Ryu makes a bold declaration. If, after watching Lee demonstrate his abilities as a top candidate, they still refuse to accept her decision, then she will step down from her position as the head of the department. 54 years ago, the heavens bestowed the Tower of Heroes upon humanity, guiding its evolution. In response, the underworld unleashed the swamp of pandemonium, corrupting all life. Humanity gained new possibilities, but at the cost of facing an overwhelming disaster. From that very chaos, Babel was born. Standing before the students, the Emperor of Ascension, Ludwig Schubert, delivers a speech about Babel's greatness, an academy that has produced countless heroes over the years. He urges the new generation to move forward and become heroes themselves. Lee listens quietly. He knows Ludwig well from his previous life. On the surface, he appears noble, but Lee understands that the truth is far more complicated. Soon after, the announcer calls for the demonstration of this year's top incoming cadets, instructing them to step onto the stage. 2 other students join Lee as they walk forward. Watching the scene unfold, Lee recalls how, in his past life, he never understood why top students acted so arrogant just because they excelled at the academy. But now he's about to understand. The announcer reveals the demonstration target, a Model 9 automaton, a combat-type golem produced by the Marionette Factory. It possesses enough power to fight evenly against a C-rank hero. Since it carries no weapons, it specializes in close combat. The first demonstration will be conducted by the top cadet of the combat faculty, a Car Cuff. Jake Myers. Recognizing the name, Lee recalls that Jake is the third son of the prestigious Myers family. Despite coming from a lineage known for swordsmanship, Jake is rumored to be an unconventional martial artist. The match begins. As soon as the signal is given, the golem charges forward, but Jake effortlessly dodges every strike. Creating distance, he suddenly shifts to offense and rushes in. What happens next shocks everyone. Jake unleashes a barrage of overwhelming punches, completely dominating the golem. Even Lee is taken aback. This is the kind of talent that appears only once in a decade, even at Babel. In his previous life, Jake only reached A rank and died young. Seeing this level of power now, Lee can't help but question what went wrong. With one final blow, Jake shatters the automaton into pieces. He stands there, completely unexhausted. The audience, the referee, everyone is stunned. Defeating something on par with a C-rank hero in mere moments is no small feat. Lee realizes that Jake has completely stolen the spotlight, which means the next participant will be under immense pressure. The referee then calls the top cadet from the support faculty. You are? Erika Inoue. Lee immediately recognizes her name. There's no need to underestimate her. As the eldest daughter of the Inoue family, one of Japan's 3 great noble houses, she possesses exceptional talent. Though she never conquered the tower, she eventually rose to become an S-rank hero, wielding a mythic-grade weapon. However, her future is tragic. In time, she becomes corrupted into a fiend and is ultimately taken down by her own family. Because of that, Lee knows there is nothing to gain from getting too close to her. As Erika walks onto the stage, she briefly glances at Lee, catching him off guard. For her demonstration, the Model 9 automaton is now equipped with armor, increasing its defensive capabilities to approximately 1.5 times that of the standard version. The test begins. Erika opens a cage she brought with her, releasing a crow. At her command, the bird takes to the sky. The golem immediately shifts into a defensive stance. Even Lee believes breaking through that defense won't be easy. But in the next instant, the crow transforms, morphing into a set of heavy armor-like mass, and dives toward the target. With a single, precise strike, the golem collapses instantly. Moments later, the crow returns to Erika's side. The crowd erupts in amazement, cheering for her performance. Watching all this, Lee begins to feel the pressure. At this rate, if he simply presents an ordinary piece of equipment, he might be booed off the stage. At last, it's time for the final demonstration, the top cadet of the engineering faculty, or SIPA. Lee is called onto the stage. From the audience, Ludwig Schubert remarks to Ryu that it has been a long time since the refining department produced a top student. He hopes the pressure won't be too overwhelming. Ryu, however, remains confident, assuring him that Lee will be just fine. Back on stage, the referee hypes up the crowd, questioning whether Lee can deliver a performance even more impressive than the previous 2 cadets. Without a word, Lee steps forward and draws his weapon, the 5-colored flame blade. The moment its rare grade status is announced, the students are visibly surprised. It's rare for a top cadet to wield a weapon of that grade. However, compared to the overwhelming displays from the other faculties, the blade appears relatively plain, leaving the crowd somewhat underwhelmed. Watching the reaction, Vice Dean Michael can't hide his satisfaction. In his mind, this only strengthens his chances of taking control of the department. Ryu, on the other hand, shows no doubt. The referee prepares to begin and announces the use of a Model 10 automaton, a combat unit equivalent to a D-rank hero. But Lee refuses. Instead, he requests a Model 8, fully equipped with armor. The referee is stunned. A Model 8 can withstand attacks even from B-rank heroes, and Lee is asking to face an armored version on top of that. He hesitates, claiming it's impossible to prepare such a unit on short notice. But in the very next moment, Instructor Kim arrives, bringing exactly what Lee requested, a fully armored Model 8. With a faint smile, Kim tells Lee to go all out. At this point, even the referee is unsure whether this is still a demonstration or something far more intense. Nevertheless, he gives the signal to begin. All eyes are now on Lee. He slowly unsheaths his blade. As he channels his mana, 5 distinct colors of flame begin to emerge, swirling around the sword. Jake watches in amazement, recognizing the technique's complexity. Meanwhile, Hans dismisses it as nothing more than flashy theatrics, convinced that someone like Lee lacks the mana to make it effective. But he couldn't be more wrong. The 5 colored flames are inherently unstable, each element conflicting with the others. Without precise control and immense mana, they would erupt violently, injuring the user. However, Lee has already found a solution. By utilizing the fire-infused scabbard, which can store flames, and combining it with his skill Artisan of Flames, he safely channels and compresses the energy within the blade. The Model 8 immediately shifts into full defensive mode. And then, Lee strikes. Activating his unique skill, Wildfire, he releases the compressed energy all at once. The 5 colored flames erupt in a controlled explosion, engulfing the battlefield in a massive surge of power. The entire arena is consumed by dust and debris. For a moment, everything goes silent. Then, as the dust settles, the result is revealed. The audience is left speechless. The sheer destruction leaves everyone in complete disbelief. Calmly, Lee sheaths his sword and glances around, casually asking if he might have gone a bit overboard, especially since a portion of the main hall has been heavily damaged. Later, Lee is summoned to Ryu's office. As soon as she arrives, Lee immediately apologizes for the damage, admitting that he should have held back more. But Ryu isn't there to scold him. Instead, an unexpected sound breaks the silence, her stomach growling. Without hesitation, she gets straight to the point. She offers to buy both the 5-colored flame blade and the fire-infused scabbard for 10 times their market value. Lee is stunned, but not because of the offer. What truly surprises him is the fact that he has already established a connection with Ryu. Lee is genuinely surprised. In his previous life, it took multiple transactions and repeated exchanges of weapons before he was able to establish a connection with Ryu. Yet this time, the bond formed almost instantly. Seeing an opportunity, Lee immediately activates Affinity Extraction. From Ryu, he obtains a special grade affinity, an iron-type material of supreme quality that generates heat by devouring other iron. Successfully extracting the ore, Lee quietly remarks that he's done. Ryu, however, misunderstands his words and assumes he has agreed to sell the weapon. But Lee immediately declines. Before she can press him further, Instructor Kim knocks and enters the room, informing her that Chairman Ludwig wishes to proceed with the presentation ceremony right away. He then asks Lee to come along. As Lee leaves, he briefly tells Ryu they will talk again later. Leaving her alone in the room, her stomach still audibly growling. Together with Instructor Kim, Lee heads toward the heart of Babel Academy, the old main building known as the Marduk Estate. Before entering, Instructor Kim reminds Lee to behave respectfully. Chairman Ludwig has already overlooked the fact that Lee damaged the auditorium during his demonstration, and he is a figure far beyond ordinary professors. Lee calmly reassures him and steps inside. There, he meets the Emperor of Ascension, Chairman Ludwig. In his previous life, Ludwig was one of the heroes who perished alongside the Sea of Ruin during the final battle, a man worthy of being called an apex climber. Ludwig praises Lee's performance and expresses interest in his future. As a reward for his talent and effort, he offers Lee 2 items. Without hesitation, Lee requests rewards that will enhance his magic power and memory. Understanding his intent, Ludwig summons 2 rare items: Heavy Dark Ink, a hero-grade material of supreme quality, and Dream Ivory, a hero-grade tool of mid-level quality. Lee is visibly surprised. Both items are extremely difficult to obtain. While they may be difficult to use at his current level, he already has an idea of how to utilize them, and he accepts the rewards with satisfaction. After leaving the office, the badge-like magical item, seemingly possessing its own will, comments on Ludwig's decision. It notes that giving 2 such rewards is highly unusual for him, but Lee clearly has the capacity to handle them. It even remarks that Lee feels like an old soul in a young body, a depth that even Ludwig himself cannot fully comprehend. Soon after, it's time for class. Inside the classroom, some students invite Hans to join them for lunch. Instead, he boasts about dining with a senior student named Howard, claiming their families are close and that he'll be receiving guidance about academy life. The other students are impressed and ask to join him. But at that exact moment, Lee enters the classroom and fixes his gaze on Hans. The atmosphere instantly changes. Hans freezes in his seat, clearly intimidated. Watching his reaction, Lee feels a sense of satisfaction. Hans is finally starting to understand his place. As Hans silently seethes, Instructor Kim enters the room. With all students present, he begins the first lesson with a unique self-introduction exercise. A staff member brings in a box filled with unusual ingots. Instructor Kim explains that the material is called projection alloy, a substance dozens of times more sensitive to mana than ordinary ores. By simply infusing it with mana, one can shape it into an armament based on their mental image. However, due to its extreme sensitivity, it's difficult to use as an actual weapon. Instead, it reflects the user's inner traits, revealing aspects of themselves they may not even be aware of. For that reason, items created from projection alloy are called avatars. Rather than traditional introductions, students will present themselves by forging these avatars. The results will even be displayed in the main building for a week. Lee isn't surprised. At Babel, even something as expensive as projection alloy, worth over 10 million won per piece, is used casually for student exercises. As the students begin, most struggle to produce anything meaningful. To Lee, it's clear they lack the most important quality. Finally, it's his turn. Stepping forward, Lee picks up the projection alloy. As the top cadet of his faculty, he decides there's no need to hold back. He pours his mana into the alloy. And in the very next moment, a massive explosion erupts in the classroom. The scene then shifts to the main building, where students passing by are left in shock after seeing Lee's projection alloy. During its creation, an abnormal phenomenon occurred. 19 nearby projection alloys were absorbed into Lee's piece. Instead of dismissing it, the professors judged this as part of Cadet Lee's unique aptitude and chose to display it as is. Even after reading the official announcement, the students remained divided. Some believe Lee is a once-in-a-generation genius, while others insist it was nothing more than luck. However, Erica and Jake see it differently. To them, even that massive amount of projection alloy wasn't enough to fully express Lee's true potential. Later, in the blacksmith training classroom, students are once again stunned, this time by the perfectly rhythmic sound of Lee's hammering. Not even a 0.0 second deviation can be heard in his strikes. Even Assistant Han begins to worry. At this level, what is there left for him to teach Lee? In the end, he decides to step aside and focus on helping the other students instead. When the class ends, Lee gathers the blades he forged and prepares to break them as usual. However, Assistant Han quickly stops him, explaining that the weapons must be submitted after this week's smithing class. Confused, Lee listens as Han explains that Babel evaluates student-crafted weapons by distributing them externally and reviewing their performance. Based on those results, the Academy provides further support. Curious, Assistant Han asks what Lee is dissatisfied with. Lee answers honestly. His biggest issue right now is his lack of stamina. He can't even properly attempt smithing heavier materials. Hearing this, Assistant Han suggests using enhancement buffs during training. It's a method Lee never considered before his regression, so the idea never crossed his mind. But now, with his current physical limitations, it makes perfect sense. With buffs, he should be able to handle heavier forging tasks. Genuinely impressed, Lee thanks him. In return, he offers advice of his own. He points out that Han is using too much mana while forging. If he reduces it to around 70% and focuses his strikes on a single point, his efficiency will improve. Assistant Han is caught off guard. Being advised by a freshman is unexpected, but he decides to give it a try. At Babel, autonomous learning is strongly encouraged. Students are free to attend classes across different departments and can even take dozens of courses in a single semester. However, they must complete their core requirements, and accumulating 3 failing grades results in immediate expulsion. Freedom comes with responsibility. With that in mind, Lee boards a train heading toward the UR faculty, specifically the Department of Shamanism. As he steps off, he finds Erica waiting ahead, accompanied by 2 other students. The two act arrogantly, telling Lee not to block their way. Annoyed, Lee firmly tells them to move instead. Ignoring the tension, Erica asks where he's headed. Lee explains that he's considering taking a secondary specialization. Interested, Erica decides to guide him herself, casually dismissing the two students and sending them ahead without her. As they walk, she asks what kind of secondary specialization he's looking for. Lee replies that he wants to learn enhancement buffs, specifically ones that improve physical ability without interfering with smithing. In response, Erica suggests a barrier technique. At first, Lee recalls that such techniques are mainly used for defense, but Erica explains that their application depends entirely on the user. To demonstrate, she takes out a letter and wraps it with a barrier spell, then hands it to Lee and asks him to try breaking it. Lee applies force, but the letter doesn't tear. Instead of increasing its strength directly, the barrier preserves the original properties while hardening in response to external force. It's a subtle but highly effective technique, especially useful for tasks like smithing, which require precise control. Erica proudly remarks that mastering such a complex application would normally require guidance from a professor. She even offers to introduce Lee to one, mentioning that the professor of barrier composition is connected to her family. As Lee examines the spell, something feels familiar. He focuses, and with a simple adjustment, he breaks the barrier with ease. Erica is left completely stunned. Calmly, Lee thanks her for the guidance and decides to register for the class. At the UR Faculty of Sorcery, students are left stunned as they see Erica walking alongside Lee. Whispers spread quickly, and rumors begin circulating, just as Lee expected. Letting out a quiet sigh, Lee can't help but wonder why people care so much about others' business. If Erica truly had any special feelings toward him, a connection would have already been established by now. Putting that aside, the two arrive at the location where Lee is supposed to take his entrance test. Erica escorts him to the testing ground for barrier construction. To his surprise, the testing ground is actually a forest. Other students can be seen wandering aimlessly, unable to find the correct location. Watching this, Lee wonders if the test is essentially a treasure hunt. Without hesitation, he begins walking forward, with Erica following behind. Then suddenly, he stomps his foot. In that instant, the barrier shatters, revealing the professor standing right in front of him. The professor is clearly shocked. Without further questions, he immediately declares that Lee has passed the test, leaving Lee slightly confused. Rewinding a bit, the professor in charge of barrier construction, Robert Perry, had been informed earlier that Erica was accompanying a student named Lee. Thanks to their presence, the number of applicants for the beginner's course had tripled. However, Robert wasn't particularly pleased. He had also received a request from the Inoue family to include a special test, the Labyrinth of Illusory Souls. This barrier distorts the senses, causing those inside to wander endlessly. It's considered a basic technique, but anyone unfamiliar with sorcery wouldn't even realize they were trapped within it. That's why Robert is so shocked. Lee broke through the barrier effortlessly, without any guidance from Erica, relying purely on instinct. Soon, other students manage to arrive as well, and Robert allows them to pass the initial stage. He then explains that the next phase will determine their class placement. A red-haired student eagerly volunteers to go first, hoping to impress Erica. Robert explains the task. They must dismantle the barrier in front of them using only their mana, without destroying its structure. Their performance will be judged based on speed and precision. The test begins. The barrier takes the form of a spider web, with a spider acting as its core. The spider senses mana through the web and continuously flees. As long as it exists, the web regenerates endlessly. The red-haired student struggles, repeatedly failing to dismantle the structure. After multiple attempts, he finally succeeds. Time: 2 minutes and 23 seconds. Robert advises him to focus more on understanding the structure rather than forcing a solution. The student leaves disappointed, unable to make the impression he wanted. One by one, the others take their turns, each facing similar difficulties. Afterward, Robert assigns them to the beginner class. Then, it's Erica's turn. With precise control, she completely dismantles the sorcery formula, collapsing the barrier in just 22 seconds. Robert acknowledges her performance, but notes that using standard dismantling methods could have reduced her time by another 2 seconds. Erica accepts the feedback calmly. Finally, it's Lee's turn. At first, he simply stands there, staring at the barrier. The other students are confused by his lack of action, but Lee sees something different. To him, the barrier resembles heavyweight, or specifically in how it repairs itself and resets if it doesn't reach a certain threshold of disruption. In order to smelt such ore, one must carefully balance multiple stimuli and apply them simultaneously. As Lee continues observing, Robert steps forward, about to call out to him, but Erica stops him. In that moment, Lee decides to test his theory, and instantly, the barrier disappears without a trace. The result leaves everyone stunned. Not only did Lee dismantle the barrier, but he also developed a new concept that could be applied to refining heavyweight ore. After completing the test, Lee quietly leaves the training ground. His recorded time is 70 minutes and 45 seconds, something that appears unimpressive to the other students. But Robert understands the truth. If Lee were to face the same barrier again, he would dismantle it in seconds. Because Lee didn't just break the barrier, he created a formula to unravel it. Watching him leave, Robert can't help but wonder what kind of extraordinary weapons Lee will create once he begins combining sorcery with his smithing skills. In the administrative office, a clerk reviews a flood of applications from professors eager to participate in the upcoming session. However, he quickly notices something unusual. Not a single submission has come from Vice Dean Michael's faction. With rumors circulating that the internal atmosphere has worsened after his son was pushed down to second place, the situation begins to make sense. Just as the clerk prepares to make a selection, he receives a message from an assistant. It states that Department Head Ryu will personally oversee Cadet Lee's intermediate smithing. Moments later, Ryu arrives at the workshop, where Lee is preparing to begin. Lee thanks her for making time despite her busy schedule, but Ryu explains that she came because she genuinely wants to see him craft a new item. With that, Lee decides to give it his all and begins smithing dark heavy stone. The process is far from simple. There are many ways to handle heavy stone, but the most difficult is the dark veil method. This technique requires placing the stone in complete darkness, where it spreads like liquid. Using only mana, the user must separate the impurities. As this happens, the size of the stone decreases while its purity increases. Though it sounds straightforward, it is essentially the restructuring of matter itself. Even for Lee, the process is demanding. He manages to reduce the stone to 1/4 of its original size. Any further reduction would compromise its performance. Next comes the second step, channeling mana through a red flame to extract precise sparks. In this stabilized state, the flames become known as Guardian Wildfire, capable of maintaining a constant temperature from the moment they are formed. Then begins the third step. Lee continuously strikes the refined stone with a hammer coated in Guardian Wildfire. The key is to maintain a steady rhythm without pause, allowing the flame's properties to gradually reduce distortion within the material. Watching him work tirelessly, Ryu begins to wonder just how much effort Lee has been putting in behind the scenes. Outside the building, Erica waits patiently. The sun begins to set, and more than 4 hours pass as Lee continues the process. Finally, after absorbing the flames to their limit, the dark, heavy stone stabilizes. The distortion disappears. With that, Lee melts the processed material and pours it into a prepared mold. Ryu is surprised. Instead of forging, Lee chooses casting, a method that alters the material's properties. She begins to wonder what exactly he is aiming to create. For the final step, Lee applies a barrier-breaking formula to slow the transformation of the material, creating a window to construct a mana circuit within it. Moments later, the process is complete. The dark, heavy stone has taken the form of a bracelet. Although Lee is unable to fully draw out the material's maximum potential, his ability to create something entirely new proves his exceptional talent. As a result, Lee acquires the D-rank skill, Black Spirit. The finished item is the Dark Spider Bracelet, a rare-grade, mid-quality artifact. It can absorb and store the wearer's mana. As soon as Ryu sees the bracelet, her stomach lets out a quiet rumble. She quickly tries to hide it, slightly embarrassed, while Lee notices. Ryu then praises the item's resonance. While not particularly strong yet, she notes that if developed further, it could potentially achieve a set effect. Lee, feeling grateful for her support, apologizes for not being able to offer her a proper piece of equipment. Instead, he hands her the remaining material and suggests she use it. Ryu activates her unique skill, Dragon Soul Furnace, and begins processing it. She casually comments that it tastes similar to crispy tempura crumbs. Watching her reaction, Lee realizes that raising her affinity level may be easier than expected. Even as she continues, Ryu keeps glancing at the dark spider bracelet, clearly interested in it. She then asks Lee about his plans for the 5-colored blade and the fire-infused scabbard. Lee calmly replies that he has no intention of selling them for now. Ryu offers a higher price, but Lee explains his reasoning. He plans to use them for the upcoming subjugation class. Besides, he adds with a smile, hunger often makes things more rewarding. He assures her that if he creates equipment worth offering, she will be the first to know. Hearing this, Ryu is visibly pleased. With the smithing complete, they decide to leave the cleanup to the staff and head out. Lee is relieved, as he has no energy left to handle it himself. However, as he tries to walk, it becomes clear that he has completely exhausted his strength. Seeing this, Ryu decides to take him back to the dormitory herself. Before leaving, she casually asks if he is afraid of heights. Without waiting for an answer, she grabs him and leaps out of the window. Even she seems surprised at how much power she can draw out after processing the material. As they travel, Lee reflects on how much has changed since before his regression. Meanwhile, outside the building, Erica continues to wait, wondering why Lee still hasn't come out. She had planned to give him an invitation to a gathering, but for now, she can only stand there and wait. Lee reads the messages spreading across the academy about Erica waiting in front of the forging department's main building for 3 hours. The rumors leave him confused, but he decides not to dwell on them. If it's truly important, he assumes she will find him herself. Soon after, Professor Ricardo Miles, who teaches the Understanding Tools class, greets the students. Without warning, he slams the door and orders everyone to head to the training center immediately, declaring that whoever arrives last will have to run 20 laps. The students are caught off guard and rush into the hallway. Even Lee is confused, as this was supposed to be a theory class, but he joins the run anyway. Everyone manages to arrive on time, except Lee. As a result, he is assigned 20 laps. Without hesitation, Lee begins running, reflecting on how poor his stamina currently is. Meanwhile, Professor Ricardo explains the reason behind the sudden change in teaching style. Originally, Understanding Tools was a theoretical class focused on weapon structures. However, due to a recent series of incidents involving individuals targeting blacksmiths, particularly those who forged high-grade fire attribute weapons, the curriculum has been revised. These attackers, known as Yomdo hunters, remain an unresolved threat, even from before Lee's regression. The professor emphasizes an important point. No matter how strong a weapon or defense may be, what ultimately matters is the strength of one's own body. From now on, the class will focus not only on understanding tools, but also on developing the physical ability to survive and protect oneself. As the lecture continues, Lee realizes he needs to be more cautious moving forward, and that improving his stamina must come first. While running, he wears the bracelet he crafted earlier. Thanks to it, all his stats increase by an average of 5 or more points. With this advantage, Lee is confident he can shape his current body into something far more capable before the end of the year. After some time, Professor Ricardo calls Lee forward to assess his swordsmanship and invites him to spar. Lee picks up a sword, aware that his movements may be restricted due to the effects of his equipment. To compensate, he decides to rely on a technique he already knows. He launches an attack, but the professor blocks it with ease. Some students assume Lee is simply exhausted from running and begin to mock him. However, the professor sees something entirely different. He recognizes the precision in Lee's movements, a style that seems to instinctively follow the correct path of the blade. Even so, Lee is still slightly rushed in execution. Deciding to end the match quickly, the professor prepares to counter. But in the next moment, as Lee charges forward, the professor experiences a sudden, vivid illusion. By the time the sensation fades, Lee has already gained the upper hand. The professor is stunned. He can't believe he felt genuine fear from a technical student to that extent. Unable to hold back his curiosity, he asks Lee who taught him such swordsmanship. Even Lee is surprised by the outcome. He recalls a memory from before his regression, when, as a blacksmith, he once broke a sword after a customer failed to pay. In return, the man offered to teach him a skill instead of paying, claiming it would be more valuable than money. That was how Lee learned this technique. However, he cannot reveal the truth, so he simply says he learned it by watching battles of heroes online. Impressed, Professor Ricardo believes he has discovered an extraordinary talent and writes Lee a recommendation letter for a body control lecture led by Professor Ma Guangsu. Later that day, Lee arrives to meet the professor. To his surprise, the instructor turns out to be the very same person who taught him that skill in his previous life. Ma Guangsu is a retired S-rank hero, also known as the sword-breaking master. Curious, Professor Ma asks Lee why he's here. Lee hands over the recommendation letter from Professor Ricardo. Jake adds that Lee is one of the top students from the Borsipa department this year. After reading the letter, Professor Ma decides to test them both. He sets a condition. He will only teach Jake if Jake can defeat Lee. The two take their stances. Lee holds a wooden sword, while Jake chooses to fight barehanded. The rule is simple. The first to land a valid hit wins. At the signal, Jake immediately charges forward. Lee responds by taking the Taoryok stance, a technique that maximizes flexibility by completely relaxing the body. Professor Ma instantly recognizes it and realizes the ideal counter would be grappling rather than striking. Jake makes the same decision and moves in to engage. As Jake closes the distance, Lee suddenly releases his sword and charges in as well. Jake overwhelms him with raw strength, but just before Lee hits the ground, he activates a technique, using explosive force to deliver a precise punch to Jake's face. A split second before impact, Lee lands the hit. That single moment decides the match. Lee wins. Seeing the same attack as before, the professor immediately orders everyone, except Lee, to leave the classroom. Even Jake is told to step out, since the condition was to land a hit on Lee first, which he failed to do. However, Lee intervenes, pointing out that if news spreads about the top student of the Akil Cup faculty being defeated by a Borsipa cadet, it would cause a major scandal. This concerns both Jake and the professor, prompting the professor to reconsider. Instead, he decides to teach Jake some fundamentals so he can prove his worth. Overjoyed, Jake bows in gratitude, but the professor quickly dismisses him, saying he has something important to discuss with Lee. Once the classroom is empty, the professor faces Lee and asks him to demonstrate the sword technique he supposedly used against Regressors. Without hesitation, Lee charges forward, but the professor easily overpowers him, disarming him in an instant. He explains that the technique relies entirely on surprise. While the concept is solid, the execution is sloppy. He then harshly criticizes the swordsmanship as crude, despite being the one who taught it. Nevertheless, the professor assures Lee that he will refine and properly develop the technique. Seizing the moment, Lee bluntly asks if this means his registration is confirmed. Amused by his straightforwardness, the professor confirms it. After leaving the classroom, Lee walks outside, reflecting on the professor's words. Suddenly, Jake runs up to him and hands him an invitation. He explains that it's for Noblesse, a gathering of cadets who take great pride in their noble backgrounds. Lee wonders if Erica had intended to give him the same invitation. Although Jake admits that the event will be filled with arrogant individuals, he believes it's a valuable opportunity. Still, Lee hesitates to accept something so prestigious. Jake insists, saying it's his way of thanking Lee for helping him stay in the class. In the end, Lee accepts the invitation and continues on his way. As he walks through the streets, Lee reflects on the subjects he has applied for so far: barrier construction and body control. He also considers taking a course in the Borsipa faculty. Lost in thought, he accidentally bumps into a female student. As he tries to apologize, she suddenly grabs his wrist, her eyes lighting up as she notices his bracelet. Excited, she asks if he made it, and even offers to enchant it for him. In that moment, Lee forms an affinity with Leah Claudel, a prodigy among prodigies in the field of enchanting. Known for creating legendary armaments by upgrading their rank by 2 full tiers, Leah has completely revolutionized the enchanting industry. Intrigued, they head to a cafe to talk further. Upon closer inspection, Leah is shocked to discover that the rare-grade wrist chain is made from heavyweight ore. She becomes deeply absorbed, muttering to herself as she examines it, overwhelmed by the countless possibilities it presents. Soon, Her excitement takes over as she questions how such high compatibility was achieved with such dense material. She eagerly talks about the numerous formulas she wants to apply, but struggles to choose just one. Hearing this, Lee casually tells her that he has more items with similar resonance effects. Impressed, Leah praises him, and Lee introduces himself as the top student of the Borsipa faculty. Their conversation flows naturally, filled with enthusiasm. However, the mood shifts when one of Erica's underlings approaches their table. Acting arrogantly, he demands that Lee follow him for a private conversation, claiming he wants to settle matters quietly. Unbothered, Lee continues drinking his coffee and tells him to speak openly. The underling then demands that Lee apologize for publicly tearing up Erica's invitation and disrespecting her. Lee calmly responds that Erica herself told him to tear it up, so there's nothing to apologize for. The underling attempts to provoke Lee further, but Lee stands his ground, asking if Erica sent him. It turns out the man is acting on his own. At that moment, Leah steps in, mocking him by pointing out that everyone knows he's just blindly following his master. Enraged, the underling releases his aura and belittles Lee, claiming that Babel is full of people far superior to him. Lee coolly responds by asking if he's referring to himself, which only fuels the man's anger. In a fit of rage, the underling launches an attack using shadow lines. However, Lee had already analyzed the technique and realized it wasn't purely composed of mana. By using a dagger as a medium, he counters the attack, even through the illusion. Shocked, the underling watches as Lee neutralizes his technique. Lee then cleverly conceals the dagger. In the next instant, he closes the distance and uses an explosive ring to deliver a powerful blow to the man's abdomen, completely shattering the illusion. With the situation resolved, Lee casually turns back to Leah and asks her to recommend a class in the enchanting department. Without hesitation, Leah suggests ancient enchantment, mentioning that there's an exceptional senior enrolled there, someone truly remarkable. After being completely beaten down, Erica's underling struggles to make his way back to his room. However, before he can get far, Erica is already waiting in his path. Calm but intimidating, she asks him to hand over the dagger. Nervous, he complies without a word. As she examines the weapon, Erica instructs him not to report the incident to her brother, stating that she will personally inform the head of the family. While analyzing the dagger, Erica notices an anti-confiscation enchantment engraved into it. This leads her to wonder if Lee developed a counter skill based on Professor Robert's theories and sorcery. Impressed, she sees Lee's potential. His aptitude for refining techniques appears to be at least S rank, while his talent for sorcery is likely around A rank. The scene then shifts to Lee, who is carefully analyzing the daggers he obtained from Erica's underlings. To his surprise, he suddenly establishes a connection with Erica, making him question whether she had been observing them earlier. Having collected dozens of daggers, Lee plans to coordinate with a black spirit mage to make full use of them. More importantly, Lee had been looking forward to Professor Kim's class, but he finds himself listening to familiar theories he already understands. Once the lecture concludes, Professor Kim begins the practical session. He explains that even with the same metal, altering the mana array can completely change its form. Demonstrating the process, he emphasizes that the diversity of weapons depends on how well one can manipulate these transformations. As a result, a blacksmith must fully understand the potential of the material they work with. For today's exercise, the students are tasked with practicing metal transformation using iron ingots. Assistant Hans distributes the materials while Professor Kim outlines the steps. First, they must manipulate the mana array to create a 3-centimeter notch at the center of the ingot, then restore it to its original form. The ingots are highly sensitive to transformation, so careful handling is essential. The time limit is set to 10 minutes. As the exercise begins, most students struggle to complete the task. Only two, Han and Lee, successfully manage to alter the ingot's shape. Seeing this, Professor Kim advances them to the next stage. He demonstrates a more complex mana array and instructs both students to replicate it. Han quickly notices that his speed and precision are comparable to Lee's, giving him confidence that he can outperform him. When Professor Kim presents another array, Han rushes ahead, determined to succeed. After completing it, he proudly believes his work is flawless. However, Professor Kim then asks him to restore the ingot to its original state. Confused, Han attempts to reverse the process but soon realizes that the mana array has been completely damaged. Professor Kim explains that the ingot could not withstand the transformation, meaning the method used was flawed from the beginning. Although Han insists he followed the instructions exactly, Professor Kim clarifies that understanding the material's limits is crucial. If an altered array cannot be restored, the equipment does not transform, it deteriorates. This significantly affects quality and performance, so Han is advised to pay closer attention to such details in the future. Though Han accepts the criticism, he glares at Lee, assuming he made the same mistake. However, in the very next moment, Lee successfully completes the array and restores the ingot to its original state. The class is left stunned, as the result should have been impossible. Even Professor Kim is visibly surprised and asks Lee to demonstrate the transformation again. Realizing the misunderstanding, Lee explains that the success was only possible because the ingot had been specially adjusted for cadets. If it had been a standard iron ingot, the process would have failed. This revelation leaves Professor Kim momentarily disappointed in himself for overlooking such a detail. The narrative briefly highlights a legendary figure, the greatest blacksmith, the artisan of flames, recants. During his time as an S-rank hero, the transformation formula he created remained unmatched for decades. Known as the truth of iron, it represents one of the most fundamental and challenging problems in blacksmithing. After the class continues for a while, it is finally dismissed. As Lee heads for the door, Professor Kim calls him back. As a token of appreciation for choosing Babel and assisting him earlier, he offers Lee a rare rank item, the Crimson Flame Gem, made from the highest quality ore. Absorbing its essence can permanently enhance one's Crimson Flame attribute. Professor Kim also recommends that Lee enroll in his Weapon Origin Study course, one of the most well-funded programs at the Academy. Lee hesitates, recalling that he had never even heard of Professor Kim before his regression, suggesting the professor may not have had a favorable future. However, seeing the recognition Kim currently holds, Lee decides to enroll, bringing his total number of courses to 4. As they shake hands, Lee once again extracts fire-infused iron from Professor Kim. That night, Lee returns to his room and begins meditating. He reflects on the idea that if metal can be extracted from a person, then the human body itself can also be forged and refined. Normally, multiple mana attributes within the body create instability, which is why most blacksmiths focus on a single attribute. However, Lee is different. Having already exhausted the mana that suppresses heat within his body, he begins drawing in the essence of the Crimson Flame. He constructs a dedicated mana circuit within himself, focused solely on this attribute. Through this process, his Crimson Flame attribute rises from F rank to E+. He also acquires an S rank skill, Body Refinement Divine Magic, and experiences a significant boost in all his stats. Finally, Lee reflects on his past life, remembering how he once gave up too easily, even when valuable resources were right in front of him. This time, however, he is determined to use every opportunity available and move forward without any regrets. In the blacksmithing class, Assistant Hans instructs all the students to put the finishing touches on the items they created in previous sessions. These completed works are scheduled for delivery both on and off campus, meaning today's results will set the tone for the entire first semester. Hearing this, the students begin working with renewed determination, hoping their weapons will earn a good price. Lee also focuses on finishing his weapon, but he is far from satisfied. His body struggles to keep up with his technique, resulting in multiple misalignments throughout the blade. Despite this, Lee knows he cannot afford to slow down, so he pushes himself to the limit. Eventually, he completes one sword, but with time running out, he decides to focus on perfecting that single piece instead of finishing all the others. As Lee immerses himself in his work, he once again begins to hear the faint sound of ocean waves, just like before his regression. This time, instead of merely applying temporary sharpness, he engraves a permanent, keen edge directly into the blade. The result is the creation of a powerful armament, the White Light Greatsword, forged purely through fundamental techniques, a hallmark of a true master blacksmith. With this achievement, Lee acquires a C-rank skill, White Light Style. The White Light Greatsword is a rare grade, high-quality weapon that enhances its sharpness when infused with mana. Considering it was crafted using only common iron, Lee deems the result impressive. It also signals that his former skills are gradually returning. Meanwhile, the other students are disheartened by the poor quality of their own creations, with some even contemplating dropping out. The next day, Lee seeks out Leah, curious about her foundational skills and wanting to observe her enhancement process. They arrive at the workshop area, which is crowded, but Leah assures him that her workspace is more secluded. As they walk, Lee comments on how far it is, and Leah casually remarks that her work isn't something easily observed. They eventually reach the outskirts, arriving at the Smithy's workshop. Upon entering, Leah loudly calls out to the shop's elderly owner, only to be scolded for shouting. The woman, who introduces herself as Helena, notices Lee and teasingly asks if he is Leah's boyfriend. Leah immediately denies it, saying there is no chance, which irritates Lee. She then introduces him as the top student of the Borsipa department. Helena scoffs, remarking that Babel must be in decline if someone so soft-looking is its top student. After brief introductions, Helena tells Leah to stop wasting time and get to work. Ignoring her blunt attitude, Leah leads Lee further into the workshop. As they walk, Lee observes Helena's skills and realizes they are far more advanced than expected, making him wonder why she runs a small shop in such a place. Inside, Leah shows Lee her enhancement palette, along with powders made from ground mana stones. While the standard uses 8 colors, Leah utilizes a much wider range. When Lee asks if her job involves restoring damaged enhancement formulas, she confirms it, explaining that it allows her to both earn money and practice without worrying about material costs. Leah begins her work on a pan, while Lee observes closely. He originally came because he heard she was in a slump, but now that he sees her in action, he starts to understand both the cause and the solution. Not wanting to interrupt her concentration, Lee decides to explore the workshop. While looking around, he notices equipment that resonates with mana circuits, sparking his urge to engrave white light again. Seeing his interest, Helena gives him permission to try, challenging him to pick any item from a nearby pile. Seizing the opportunity, Lee selects a knife. Helena questions his choice, but Lee explains that the blade's edge is perfectly aligned and its axis is not warped, indicating it was made by someone who truly understands swordsmanship. He then carefully selects a whetstone with evenly compressed mana particles, confident that the blade's owner could handle an edge sharpened to its absolute limit. As Lee begins sharpening, Helena watches closely, visibly surprised by his technique and questioning whether he is truly a freshman. Shortly after, Leah finishes her own work and joins them. She quickly realizes that Helena is trying to find flaws in Lee's process, but is unable to do so, which frustrates her. Moments later, Lee completes the sharpening and calmly tells Helena that it's the best he can do for now, but he will do even better next time. Without another word, Helena orders both of them to leave the workshop, her gaze fixed on the knife Lee just refined. Sometime later, a man, who appears to be Helena's brother, arrives and asks for the knife he usually uses, mentioning he has a backlog of orders. Helena sighs and questions when he plans to quit his restaurant job, reminding him that he is supposed to be a lead professor in the swordsmanship department. He brushes off her concern and grabs the knife, only to notice its incredible sharpness. Surprised, he asks if Helena sharpened it, but she denies it, revealing that it was done by a freshman. Intrigued, both of them are left wondering just who Lee really is. As they walk back toward the faculty, Lee learns that Helena was once a professor in the Department of Metallurgy, but retired 5 years ago to open a small hardware shop in Akelcup. Curious, Lee tries to learn more from Leah, but even she doesn't know much. She does mention, however, that several professors have left the metallurgy department over the past decade. This catches Lee's attention, as he recalls that in the future, it becomes the weakest department at Babel. Changing the subject, Leah asks Lee for feedback on her enhancement work. Lee acknowledges that her skills are impressive but points out a major flaw. Her thinking is too narrow. Hearing this, Leah's expression immediately hardens. Lee explains that she likely considered a better method but chose not to use it. Not knowing something can be fixed through learning, but knowing and still holding back is a serious issue. For a creator, imagination is both a weapon and a talent, and Leah is suppressing hers. Leah challenges him, asking if he thinks she's unaware of that herself. Letting out a sigh, Lee pulls out a dagger and hands it to her, saying he doesn't have much time, so she should pay close attention. He explains his perspective. If forging is like placing a stone beneath the water's surface, then enhancement is like carving the image of that submerged stone above the surface. In other words, enhancement carries a dreamlike nature. To demonstrate, Lee introduces concepts like the crimson lotus and white radiance flow, techniques that apply enhancements beneath the surface rather than just externally. He explains that if a single layer isn't enough, the structure can be divided into multiple layers. By following the flow of crimson lotus, even killing intent can be embedded into the weapon itself. He admits it may not seem extraordinary, but for a genius like Leah, even this idea could open a new path forward. After thinking it over, Leah asks to borrow the dagger so she can remake it properly and return it later. Lee agrees, even handing over several more daggers for her to practice with. Overjoyed, Leah rushes off, eager to test her ideas. At that moment, Lee successfully establishes a connection with her. Later, Lee heads to the arena, where a match is taking place between two prominent students. However, his main concern is understanding why Erica continues to follow him. Realizing she won't stop even if he asks, Lee decides to make use of the situation. He casually approaches her and taps her shoulder, extracting affinity stones in the process. From Erica, he obtains a high-grade society contact stone of mid-low quality. From Leah earlier, he had acquired a high-grade Ms-explosion catalyst stone of the highest quality. At the arena, the announcer, Lan Fong, the youngest professor at Babel, welcomes the new students and introduces the competitors. The first is Aria Myers, the top senior of Akelcup's fourth-year class, and heir to the prestigious Myers family, known for producing S-rank heroes. She has held the #1 rank in the Martial Hall for 3 consecutive years, set multiple records, and is an active A-rank hero. Revered as the Holy Sword Master who conquered the Hero's Tower, Aria captivates the audience with both her beauty and overwhelming achievements. Her opponent is Yom Seonga, a third-year student ranked 10th in the Martial Hall and the top of the Spear Arts department. He is also the inheritor of Korea's intangible cultural heritage technique, the Flame Wheel Withering Blossom Spear. As the match begins, Yom charges forward, but Aria effortlessly blocks his attack. She quickly overwhelms him without breaking a sweat. Watching the fight, Lee grows disappointed, feeling that Yom's abilities fall below expectations. He wonders whether Yom failed to receive the proper support expected of someone with such a prestigious inheritance. While several aspects concern Lee, the biggest issue in his eyes is Yom's weapon. The match concludes with Yom admitting defeat. As the professor prepares to interview both participants, Yom unexpectedly leaves the arena, leaving Aria alone in the spotlight. Noticing Yom's frustration, Lee also decides to leave, uninterested in watching Aria's remaining matches, as he finds her presence irritating. Meanwhile, Erica realizes that Lee didn't come to watch her brother and begins to question why he seems so displeased. Unbeknownst to Lee, Aria overhears his earlier remarks about her and becomes intrigued by him. At a park near the Martial Hall, Yom sits quietly, meditating while taking in the fresh air. Lee arrives and spots him from a distance, noting that Yom hasn't lost control like before. This gives Lee hope that, this time, he might obtain Yom's bond stone without things turning violent. Despite his rough temperament, Yom was once a key member of the Final Strike Force and ultimately lost his life in the battle against the demon deity of the Annihilation Sea. Sensing someone behind him, Yom opens his eyes and asks if Lee had been watching his match. Lee confirms, which impresses Yom, as it means Lee was able to track him down. Turning to face him, Yom realizes that Lee is the top student of the Borsippa faculty. He immediately asks why Lee has come, but Lee finds his guarded attitude unusual. Lee expresses his desire to talk, but Yom coldly turns his back and tells him to leave. Refusing to back down, Lee persists. Yom then makes his stance clear. He despises weaklings, especially those who rely on cheap tricks and falsely believe themselves to be his equal. Because of that, he has no intention of listening and orders Lee to leave again. Surprisingly, Lee finds Yom far more restrained than before his regression. Realizing that reasoning won't work, Lee activates the Crimson Stone, signaling that he has no intention of backing down. Yom immediately stands and prepares to fight. In response, Lee warns him that the legacy of the Flame Wheel Withering Blossom Spear could end because of him. Enraged, Yom charges forward and throws a mana-infused punch, but Lee activates Greed Iron and deflects the attack with ease. Yom acknowledges Lee's strength as a top student, but notes that the lingering traces of mana, Ember Trails, are the true power of his spear technique. The two clash again, but Lee quickly forces Yom back. To Yom's shock, the Ember Trails begin responding to Lee as well. He realizes that Lee has not only broken through them, but effectively taken control. Furious, Yom attacks repeatedly, but Lee dodges each strike with precision. Lee can tell that Yom is on the verge of losing control, the same volatile temper that once led to the Yomwa Gate incident. As Yom launches another attack, Lee narrowly avoids it, but his body is reaching its limit, and the effects of Greed Iron are fading. Realizing how much effort it's taking to build a clean connection, just as Yom finds an opening and moves in to land a decisive blow, Jake suddenly appears and blocks the attack. Recognizing Jake, Yom asks if he knows Lee. Jake confirms, and Yom immediately halts the fight, ordering both of them to leave. Jake quickly pulls Lee away, clearly shaken. As they retreat, Lee tells Yom to remember what he said, which only makes Jake more anxious as he urges Lee to hurry. Left alone, Yom reflects on his actions, realizing he nearly lost control and attacked Lee recklessly. He fears that if things had continued, both the legacy of the Flame Wheel Withering Blossom Spear and his master's reputation would have been tarnished. As Lee and Jake walk away, Jake questions why Lee provoked Yom in the first place, pointing out that if he hadn't intervened, Lee could have been seriously hurt. Lee simply laughs it off, saying he was only trying to intimidate Yom. In reality, Lee has already achieved his goal, forming a bond with Yom. Now, all that remains is to extract the Affinity Stones. However, the Yom he knows is the Mad Dog version, so if Yom is calmer this time, the Bond Stone's effect may differ. Because of this, Lee realizes he'll need to carefully consider how to raise Yom's bond level. Shifting his attention, Lee checks on Jake and asks if his hand is all right. Jake shows him a minor scratch and reassures him that it's nothing serious. As they continue talking, Jake brings up something unexpected. He asks if Lee said anything about his sister, Arya, back at the arena. Lee casually replies that it was nothing important, just that he finds her annoying. That single comment shocks Jake. In that moment, he finally understands why Arya kept asking about Lee. She has taken an interest in him. But Lee simply smiles and says that is exactly what he wanted. In truth, Yom's greatest obsession is surpassing Arya, so if Lee gains attention from Yom's rival, his own presence will naturally stand out even more. Jake still tries to warn Lee about his sister, but Lee casually remarks that he already knows Arya is very manipulative. Hearing this, Jake is completely stunned and quickly looks around to make sure no one else heard it. He then asks what Arya could have possibly done to make Lee dislike her so much. In reality, Arya was once known as the Holy Swordmaster before she suddenly disappeared without a trace. The person who returned in her place wielded a sword forged from the remains of the demon god of annihilating light. Since Lee cannot reveal any of this, he simply tells Jake that he cannot stand looking at Arya's face. After saying that, Lee leaves, while Jake remains frozen in confusion, wondering what kind of history exists between the two of them. Moments later, Jake receives a message from Arya ordering him to act as her middleman from now on and report everything related to Lee. She also mentions that she already heard Lee call her manipulative. Reading the message, Jake instantly realizes he made a huge mistake. The next morning, Lee sits inside the lecture hall with his entire body aching from yesterday's battle against Yom. Soon, the professor arrives and introduces himself as Reese Doba, announcing that he will oversee their attribute smithing class for the next 2 weeks. The students immediately become disappointed since the professor is infamous for his harsh and unpredictable teaching methods. Before beginning the lesson, Professor Doba announces the evaluation results for the items submitted during last week's major smithing class, along with the first semester budget allocation. One by one, students are called forward to receive their budgets, and eventually it becomes Lee's turn. Hans watches curiously, wondering how much Lee will receive, but everyone is shocked when the professor reveals that Lee will not receive a budget yet. Instead, his work was considered so exceptional that it has been placed alongside second-year creations for the Academy's open auction on Wednesday. Professor Doba explains that Lee's budget will be decided after the final auction bid, so he must wait until then. Lee figures there is no issue since Professor Kim would have stopped it otherwise, so he calmly accepts the decision. The professor then explains that today's lesson will focus on residual mana and reveals that a cadet volunteered to assist with the class. When the cadet enters the room, the students are stunned to see that it is Yom. The class immediately erupts in whispers, wondering why someone like him is there. Professor Doba quiets everyone down and begins explaining that residual mana in weapons is generally divided into two categories, the charge type and the independent type. The charge type stores mana directly, while the independent type can either generate mana on its own or absorb it from the surroundings. Both types have strengths and weaknesses, but the independent type is far more difficult to create because its mana core changes depending on the material, technique, and the creator's mana flow. The professor then asks Yom to demonstrate the charge type. Yom showcases highly volatile fire mana and explains how difficult it is to maintain residual mana with such an unstable element. However, once properly controlled, its endurance becomes exceptional. To demonstrate, he performs the flame wheel blossoming spear technique. Hans watches in amazement as Yom manipulates fire mana with incredible precision, especially since many students still struggle to control fire inside a basic furnace. After the demonstration, Professor Doba assigns the technique as their next project, which will be due next Thursday. As the lecture transitions into forging class, the students immediately rush toward Yom, believing this might be their only chance to speak with him. However, Yom rejects every single one of them, including Hans. The disappointed students slowly leave for their next class, while Yom remains behind, clearly waiting for Lee. He suddenly asks Lee how much he knows about him. Lee calmly replies that he knows mastery of the flame wheel blossoming spear technique is measured by the number of wheels one can maintain. He also mentions that the current head of Yoma Gate, the A-rank hero Lee Wonryeong, reached 8 wheels. According to Lee, Yom already maintained 3 effortlessly, meaning he could probably sustain 6 if he truly pushed himself. Hearing this, Yom steps closer and demands to know why Lee is bringing it up. Lee then reveals that Yom once reached 7 wheels, but one day suddenly lost the ability to maintain them. Yom is completely shocked because he never shared this secret with anyone, not even the gate master. As Lee continues walking, he comments that Yom possesses extraordinary talent with fire mana. Yet something about his flames feels restrained, as though he has plenty of power but refuses to let it fully erupt. Desperate for answers, Yom asks Lee for the real reason behind his condition, but Lee has no intention of explaining it so easily. Yom quickly offers to give Lee anything he wants in exchange for help. Lee then sets 2 conditions. First, Yom must fairly compensate him for every piece of advice he provides. Second, whenever Yom encounters something difficult to judge, he must consult Lee directly. After laying out the conditions, Lee tells Yom to make his decision before they reach the forge area. Without hesitation, Yom agrees, but only if Lee can first prove that his words are true. After this, they head to the forging room where Lee immediately begins forging without even sketching a blueprint, leaving the students shocked as they whisper among themselves. Meanwhile, Lee combines fire attribute ore and dark attribute ore in a 7:3 ratio, causing the first-year students to assume the mana will simply dissipate. Ignoring their comments, Lee continues heating the material until elemental mana starts leaking out. He then carefully adjusts both the flames and the mana flow at the same time, allowing the metal to absorb the elemental energy through a process known as thermal displacement. Even the professor is surprised that Lee is already capable of using such an advanced technique. Lee knows the others only see ordinary thermal displacement, but Yom is witnessing something entirely different. As Yom watches closely, Lee keeps the fire attribute mana spreading outward from the inside, while the dark attribute mana pushes inward from the outside. This perfect balance between the two opposing energies allows them to form a flawless circle. At that moment, Yom realizes that his second attribute mana, which had always been forbidden because it interfered with the solar wool spear technique, could actually be used exactly as Lee demonstrated. Yom immediately tries it himself, only to discover that his control drops to the 5th wheel. He tells Lee that he successfully formed the Black Flame Wheel, but he no longer has enough strength to maintain 6 wheels. He casually replies that 5 Black Flame wheels should already be stronger than 7 regular ones. However, Yom quickly rejects the idea and explains that the Yoma sect regularly sends instructors to evaluate successor candidates living outside the sect. If his level falls below the 6th wheel, he will lose his position as successor. Because of this, Lee suggests using the old method temporarily, but Yom reveals that it will not work either since he can no longer properly control dark attribute mana. Lee realizes the situation is more serious than expected, especially after learning that the instructor will arrive tomorrow. Determined not to let Yom lose his successor status, Lee starts searching for another method that can work within a single day. He then asks Yom if he is willing to do anything to secure his position. Yom immediately agrees, so Lee extracts the Crimson Resonance Blackstone from him and announces that they will first change Yom's weapon. The two then head to Akelcup's private training room, a facility reserved only for the top 100 martial arts hall rankers or the top 30 faculty members. Lee tells Yom to stop wasting time, so Yom reshapes the training room to resemble the grounds of the Yoma sect. Seeing this, Lee jokingly asks if he is feeling homesick. Yom calmly explains that his master sent the environment setting to him, so he occasionally uses it for training. Without delay, Lee begins crafting tools and splits the extracted bond into 2 separate pieces. He then binds each piece to a spear before handing both weapons to Yom, who looks completely confused about why he suddenly needs dual spears. Lee explains that using 2 spears is far more effective for handling dual attribute mana. He then instructs Yom to create a flame wheel with his left hand while releasing dark mana with his right. Yom focuses carefully and follows the instructions, but something unusual immediately happens. Lee quickly realizes what Yom has been lacking all this time. Without noticing it himself, Yom allows dark mana to flow into his left hand naturally. Normally this would not be a major issue, but because Yom spent years suppressing dark mana, the 2 attributes now interfere with each other severely. That is why Lee creates a new training method focused on controlling both attributes simultaneously, which should allow Yom to easily regain the 6th wheel. Lee even gives Yom a special wristband to wear during training. After 3 hours, Yom adapts rapidly and becomes noticeably better at handling both attributes. Watching this, Lee wonders if the method works so well because it was originally developed by Yom's future self. Curious about Yom's natural talent, Lee carefully studies his breathing patterns, muscle movements, and shifts in balance. Noticing Lee staring intensely, Yom asks what he is looking at, but Lee casually replies that he is gathering data to create Yom's future weapon. Hearing this makes Yom unexpectedly happy, and he quietly tries to hide his reaction. A little later, Lee asks if there is a deeper reason Yom wants to protect his successor position so badly. Yom's expression darkens as he quietly explains that his master wants him to become the next sect leader, and as a disciple, he simply wishes to fulfill that expectation. Yom Sunga was once an orphan with no family before being taken in by the S-rank hero and first leader of the Yoma sect, Yom Jinhyun. Although the former sect leader retired after suffering serious injuries and losing much of his strength, his influence over Yom as both a master and father figure remains absolute. While continuing his training, Yom suddenly pauses and asks Lee why he is helping him in the first place. Lee explains that he plans to enter the 6 great demon realms someday, but to survive those dangerous places, he will need strong allies capable of protecting him. He also needs rare materials to forge powerful weapons for them. That is why he is helping Yom, who will one day become sect leader and possess both the influence and resources needed to support him. Yom comments that Lee's reasoning sounds extremely practical. Lee simply responds that he is not helping people out of kindness alone. Yom then declares that if Lee truly helps him become the leader of the Yoma sect, he will personally accompany Lee into the 6 great demon realms. Hearing those words makes Lee remember the past, because Yom once made the exact same promise with the same determination. At that moment, Lee activates the Karma Seal within the Crimson Resonance Blackstone and silently resolves to make Yom the next sect leader no matter what happens. The next day, Yom greets Kong Hyun-woon, the 7th ring instructor of the Flame Gate, who arrives alongside several others to oversee Yom's examination. Curious about the unfamiliar faces, Yom asks who they are, and Kong explains that they are disciples personally selected by the clan master to observe the sparring match. While discussing the matter, Kong casually refers to Yom as the future clan master, but Yom immediately interrupts him and firmly states that the next clan master has not been decided yet, so Kong should choose his words carefully. Kong quickly apologizes before asking if they should begin testing Yom's current level. However, Yom shocks everyone by revealing that he intends to apply for promotion to the 7th ring. Kong, who has always underestimated Yom, is left stunned by the announcement. He then recalls the instructions given by the next clan master candidate, who told him to fight seriously if Yom ever challenged for 7th ring promotion. Kong explains that from the 7th ring onward, the test also includes a sparring match against an instructor, so he advises Yom to wait longer since it is still too early for him. In response, Yom mocks Kong and asks if he is afraid of losing his instructor title. The taunt immediately angers Kong, who accepts the challenge without hesitation. After retrieving his spear, Kong explains the rules for the 7th ring promotion match. The battle will be a domain sparring contest, a direct clash of power where victory depends on whose flame ring is stronger. To pass, Yom must either win or force a draw. As the spar begins, Yom surprises everyone by wielding 2 short spears instead of a traditional weapon. Kong laughs at him and ridicules the crude fighting style, but Yom ignores the insults and activates black attribute mana. Seeing this, Kong begins lecturing him, but Yom calmly replies that Kong will understand once their powers collide. Yom's confident attitude only makes Kong more furious. Kong declares that Yom will regret his arrogance before proudly displaying his flame rings. However, the moment their powers clash, Kong is completely shocked to discover that his flame rings are being torn apart. Before long, Kong is forced to admit defeat, giving Yom both victory and promotion to the 7th ring. After the match, Lee asks what happens next, and Yom explains that once the promotion ceremony is completed, he will officially be recognized as both an instructor and the formal successor of the Flame Gate. Lee then asks about the conditions required to become clan master. Yom reveals that there are 2 requirements: reaching the 8th ring and earning the support of the majority of the instructors. Curious, Lee asks if Yom can gain the instructor's approval, and Yom replies that he can likely convince them through sparring matches, although future battles will be much harder since they will not use domain sparring rules anymore. Hearing this, Lee confidently states that Yom will achieve it soon because today's result already proves his potential. Lee only tells Yom to start thinking about how he plans to repay the favor later. Yom responds that he is willing to do anything within his power. Yom then mentions another request he wishes to commission from Lee. Lee is surprised that Yom is already asking for another weapon so soon. After witnessing today's match, Yom realized how extraordinary Lee's forging skills truly are, especially since he created such a powerful weapon in only a few hours. Now Yom wants to see what kind of spear Lee could make next, and asks him to forge an even better weapon. At that exact moment, Lee receives a notification informing him that Yom's bond level has increased to level 2. The scene then shifts to the auction house, where professors are presenting weapons crafted by the students. Lee and Erica also attend the auction, but they wear disguises to avoid drawing attention. Professor Kim insisted that Lee should appear at the event because public image matters, especially now that Lee has become the center of attention. In addition, Lee is curious about Michael's apparent scheme to take control of the refining department. Soon, the commentator announces the auction theme, revealing that a total of 36 iron swords have been submitted. A special quality verification process has also been prepared for the event. The commentator then introduces Seojumpo, weaving together the fur of the white tiger, an S-rank magic beast. Because of its unique steel-like properties, the fabric is highly resistant to slashing attacks. However, weak weapons with poor durability will instantly fail against it. The auction organizers plan to use this material to identify defective products during testing. One by one, the swords are tested as the audience watches excitedly. Sitting beside Lee, Erica asks if he understands why they are using such a method. Lee explains that the white tiger's abilities are unusually complex because its fur, hide, and bones all possess different properties. Among them, the fur copies the sharpness of any metal weapon that touches it, gradually destroying the weapon's durability regardless of its quality. After hearing this explanation, Erica wonders if the white light greatsword might be at a disadvantage. However, Lee simply laughs and says the entire setup is an obvious attempt to target both him and Professor Kim. If the sword breaks during the test, Professor Kim's reputation would suffer as well. Still, Lee calmly points out that their plan only works if the sword actually breaks. Finally, it becomes the white light greatsword's turn for inspection. The commentator announces the start of the quality verification, and the examiner swings the sword toward the white tiger fabric. However, the moment the blade touches the material, something unexpected happens. The sword suddenly reacts violently, slips from the examiner's hand, and lands into the ground, leaving Michael and the others completely stunned as they wonder what just happened. Lee quickly takes advantage of the situation and steps onto the stage to explain what just happened. He begins by describing how a normal sharpness aura would usually break apart when coming into contact with Seojumpo. However, the white light greatsword functions differently. It gathers mana scattered throughout the atmosphere and condenses it along the blade into an extremely thin edge. People are amazed by this explanation and try to sense the mana for themselves, but most of them cannot perceive it clearly no matter how hard they focus. Lee calmly explains that this is normal because the mana density is not high enough to qualify as sword chi. Still, the energy is far sharper than ordinary light, which is why he refers to it as sharpness aura. Hearing this explanation, Erica asks if the strange phenomenon from earlier was also caused by the sharpness aura. Lee confirms her theory and further explains that when two identical sharpness auras collide, they create resonance instead of canceling each other out. After explaining the concept, Lee decides to demonstrate something even more impressive. He pulls out Erica's bond stone, breaks it to activate its effect, and the blade instantly absorbs the released mana. As the fluctuating mana within the greatsword stabilizes, Lee carefully guides the energy into a proper flow. Moments later, the sword is tested again, and everyone is shocked to discover that its rank has risen from high rank to rare rank. Lee then explains the newly added effect responsible for the upgrade and tells the auction manager to adjust the starting price accordingly. Hearing this, the manager immediately raises the starting bid from 1 million won to 5 million won. Since the weapon was crafted by Lee, who has recently become the center of attention, and because the sword evolved into a rare rank item during the demonstration itself, the audience becomes extremely excited. To many people, the weapon is not only valuable, but also an entirely new research opportunity. The bidding begins immediately, and the price rises rapidly. Eventually, Jake raises the bid to 200 million won, but Erica quickly counters with 210 million won. The manager asks if there are any more offers, prompting Jake to increase the amount once again. Erica refuses to back down and continues competing against him. Watching the numbers climb higher and higher leaves Lee amazed at how casually wealthy families spend enormous amounts of money. Suddenly, a new bidder enters the auction and offers 600 million won. Jake is completely stunned by the massive price increase, but he also fears disappointing his sister, who ordered him to obtain Lee's weapon at any cost. Unfortunately for both Jake and Erica, the bidder turns out to be Director Yunha, someone far beyond their financial reach. Realizing they cannot compete, both of them withdraw from the auction. The manager then officially sells the white light greatsword to Director Yunha. Even Lee is shocked by the final amount. After the auction ends, Lee receives the payment for the greatsword and asks Director Yunha how she plans to use it. Yunha explains that she intends to bring the weapon into a dangerous zone because a sword of this quality would be wasted if used only for training. Interested in seeing the greatsword in actual combat, Lee suggests visiting Yunwal Mountain and asks if he can accompany her. Yunha immediately recognizes the location as the site selected for the first-year students' upcoming subjugation training. Lee confirms that he simply wants to visit the area in advance. Yunha considers the offer carefully and is about to decline, but Lee suddenly offers to craft any armament she wants in return. Hearing this, Yunha instantly agrees and decides they will leave next week. Lee accepts the arrangement without hesitation. In truth, Lee has another reason for choosing Yunwal Mountain. Jürgen Kreuger, known as the Summer Climber, is the chairman of the UD Group, the world's leading global corporation and the strongest necromancer alive. One of the artifacts he lost after being attacked by a demon from Pandemonium is secretly hidden within Yunwal Mountain. The scene then shifts to Jake, who gathers enough courage to meet Arya and admit that he failed to obtain the White Light greatsword for her. Arya appears calm as she listens to the news while Jake repeatedly apologizes. Instead of becoming angry, Arya tells him that what is done cannot be changed, so they should focus on their next move. Since Lee and Jake attend the same class, Arya instructs Jake to find an opportunity to approach Lee directly. She even promises to speak to their father about the succession ceremony again if Jake handles the situation properly. At the same time, she reminds him how unstable his current position already is and warns that another mistake could easily cost him his place as valedictorian. Before Arya can continue, Jake hurriedly interrupts and promises that he will do whatever it takes to obtain the sword from Lee. Arya smiles again and calmly asks whether he truly thinks it is acceptable to interrupt her while she is speaking. Realizing his mistake, Jake immediately apologizes. Arya then coldly instructs him to bring the sword to her by any means necessary. The reason behind her obsession is simple. For reasons she cannot fully explain, Lee continues to irritate her more and more with every encounter. In the next class, Lee presents the short spears he forged as his assignment. The professor is immediately shocked after checking the stats of the high-grade, mid-high-quality weapons. The craftsmanship alone is already impressive, but what truly surprises him are the flame wheel and auxiliary formulas engraved within the spears. These formulas automatically repel attribute mana whenever the user's control becomes unstable, effectively warning the wielder before a mistake can occur. Deeply impressed, the professor awards Lee a perfect score and even exempts him from future attendance. Hearing this announcement causes the other students to whisper among themselves, calling Lee a genius while wondering why someone with his ability is still attending classes alongside ordinary first years. After finishing the evaluation, Lee prepares to leave the classroom, but the professor hands the spears back to him and asks Lee to contact him if he ever decides to sell them. Carrying the weapons with him, Lee heads toward Professor Guang's class instead. When Lee opens the dojo doors, he finds Jake already training inside. Jake is surprised to see him and asks whether Lee has a class today. Lee casually replies that he simply arrived early to get some practice done and offers to leave if Jake wants the room to himself. However, Jake immediately stops him because he wants to ask Lee for a favor. Before Jake can even explain, Lee refuses instantly since he already knows Jake wants him to forge a weapon for Arya. Lee makes it clear that he has absolutely no intention of doing that and tells Jake to give up. Just like director Yunha, Lee cannot allow Arya to lose interest in him. With his current skills, anything he creates would only raise her expectations even further. Realizing persuasion alone will not work, Jake pulls a weapon called the Hammer of Black Flames from his bag and presents it to Lee. The hammer was forged using refined dragonite, and both sides are infused with fire and dark attribute mana to amplify the power of each element. Lee carefully examines the weapon before admitting that it is actually quite impressive. Jake then proposes another duel. If Lee loses, he must agree to forge a weapon for Arya. Hearing this, Lee adds another condition of his own. If Jake loses, he cannot mention his sister's name for an entire month, and he must also make sure Arya knows about the agreement. Jake thinks about it briefly before accepting, and the two prepare for their match. As they get ready, Jake recalls how Lee caught him off guard with a counterattack during their previous duel. This time, he plans to fight seriously from the very beginning. Lee notices Jake compressing an enormous amount of mana simply by clenching his fist, so he quietly deactivates the social link stone and activates Gluttony Iron instead. Lee then casually spins the short spear in his hand, making Jake realize he looks surprisingly experienced with it. Jake briefly wonders whether blacksmiths are trained to handle different weapons, but he quickly dismisses the thought and convinces himself that Lee cannot defeat him with a weapon he only recently learned to use. The duel begins as both fighters clash head-on. Jake attacks with full determination, intending to secure victory this time, but Lee has no intention of losing so easily. He counters with the Flame Wheel Ember Spear technique, leaving Jake completely stunned. Before regressing, Lee spent a long time listening to Yom's stories and techniques. At first, he only did it to improve their bond level, but once Yom truly opened up to him, The two shared techniques they had never taught anyone else. Although Lee was constantly mocked and criticized back then, he can now at least recreate a rough imitation of those techniques. Using that knowledge, Lee steadily overwhelms Jake and disrupts his rhythm completely. Jake soon realizes he is being dragged around the battlefield and can no longer control the flow of the fight. However, he quickly figures out that the only way to turn things around is to stall until Lee's technique weakens. Because of this, Jake focuses entirely on dodging while widening the distance between them. Lee immediately understands Jake's strategy and even compliments him for being a top student for a reason. In response, Lee decides to use the mana stored within Yome's ink spider bracelet. Jake is shocked after seeing Lee pull off something like that, so he instantly counters by activating the Myers-style formless sword, blue axis technique, allowing him to perform sword arts barehanded. Seeing Jake push himself this far, Lee decides to stop holding back as well and unleashes the Flame Wheel Ember Spider, First Revision, Eclipse Crescent. Lee cannot afford to lose this duel either. Their attacks collide with tremendous force, and for a brief moment, it looks as though both of them will land decisive blows at the exact same time. Realizing the outcome, Jake finally accepts his defeat. With this duel, Lee successfully establishes a bond with Jake.